Hello, beautiful creatures, and welcome to this week's episode of Embodied. I feel like I have the best job in the world because what seems to consistently happen with every single season of the podcast is I get the opportunity to sit down with some people that I don't know, but some people that I know only too well and only too intimately. And so today is one of those treats. We have Miriam Binder with us today, and she is an absolutely stunning integrative coach. She's a faculty member with Integral Coaching Canada, and she's become somewhat of an inspiration for me in how we shift from a previously really astute, insightful, protective identity that is wrapped into a particular world, a particular job, a particular way of being, and how we shift beyond that, let's say, into versions of ourselves that have the capacity for deep intuition, deep wisdom, deep energetic resonance. And that change really has carried Miriam through to the job that she does now with such skill. So I thought I'd bring a little bit of the gems and the wisdom of Miriam to your doors, to your ears, to your eyes. Miriam, thank you for spending the time with us. I will fire us through a whole series of really gorgeous developmental questions, but for now, please receive such warm thanks from me for being here.
Thank you, my dear. Actually, it's such a gift for me as well to spend time with you and receive you in the beauty of all your person. And what a gift you are to me, that I was able, through being on faculty at Integral Coaching Canada, to meet you and receive some of your presence and gifts.
So I think that might actually be where I start. So the background for the audience is that I can't even remember when it was, 2 years ago now, I did a really beautiful training with Integral Coaching Canada, with ICC, and I'm actually going to be taking my second stage with them this summer. And Miriam was my, I suppose, something like a mentor and a supervisor. So she wasn't the person that was teaching the initial material, because she teaches at the professional level rather than the associate level that I was entering in at. But she was the person that held my hand through the process of getting certified. And so what she offered really was this stunning space holding and guidance as I trod my first footsteps in the integral method. And you just mentioned, Miriam, that presence is one of the things that you appreciate. Maybe there's a mutual appreciation between us. And so I guess I wonder, for the listeners and the viewers, coming into true resonant presence as a human being, as a mother, as a businesswoman, as a coach, what does that mean for you, for those that are just getting familiar with that idea?
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's putting words on something that is more felt than known, I think. Presence for me is when I can truly be with someone and not be interrupted, let's say, by my own trains of thoughts, by my own reactivity. And noticing what's going on for me when I'm interacting with the other without being reactive, really.
So it has this globality. It sounds like you're talking about not being interrupted by the mind, but also being aware of all of the aspects of you, all of the sensations within you. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's that combination. I'm both awareness and I'm also not distracted or diverted by forces within me that maybe aren't integrated by this stage or aren't in my conscious domain.
Yeah, I think that it's almost two layers, right? One is a steadiness in being with the other, and at the same time a capability to witness what's going on for me, because that can be really interesting information when I'm interacting. So sometimes, for example, it's my body that will tell me something about what's going on in the space between us. And I can, as a coach, maybe that's something I want to get curious about. It also can be something maybe that I want to shift in the space, or something that I want to attend to, maybe a tenderness with the other. And I want to offer more stability in that moment, or more grounding. Yeah, so it's really both. It's the continuous being with the other while noticing what's going on in me and seeing how that may be a reflection of what's going on with the other.
That sounds in some ways like a very courageous practice. And I say practice because it is something that you would have to cultivate day after day after day, this constant noticing of, oh, okay, where am I in this moment? Have I become a distorted version of myself? Where am I operating from in this interaction with this particular person? So there feels to me like in what you're describing, there's something of huge bravery and commitment to truth and to the full depth of this one lived day or this one lived relationship, that we're willing to stay with all of the layers of what is, rather than maybe taking a more superficial approach that says, well, I know what this is, and so I'll act from default or I'll act from habit.
It's interesting. I don't think I've ever thought of this being courageous. And in a way, it's a saying yes to just what is constantly. And it is a practice. And for me, there was a discovery in my, when we work in the second level of training with ICC, we do a practice when we were back then training in person, just looking in the eyes of another person. And I was so overwhelmed by intensity. And I thought, if I have to do that for an entire session, I'll be completely drained. So it's a constant coming back to it and a saying yes to the presence, and maybe a feeling safe within myself and a trust that I can hold whatever is coming up in the space.
I was sitting last night with two very inspiring women who are also in this field, and one of the things that we were talking about, one of them has gone through the most incredible journey with grief, actually, and the other one, they're both very active, dynamic, space-holding, relatively well-known women. And one of the things that we were reflecting on was that either through nature or through nurture, all three of us had cultivated a real willingness to be with challenge and discomfort, almost as though that was as valuable or as important or as much a part of life as the bright spots. And that there was almost a kind of intrepid quality with which we were willing to walk toward whatever the unhealth or the issue or the opportunity was. Almost saying to ourselves, I don't know what this will be. I don't know how this will go. I don't know whether in the passage of time I'll be able to see it as a good thing or as a bad thing. But for now, even if it is a challenging scenario, I'm willing to walk with it in curiosity. I feel like that's what you're describing. And I suppose that's part of why I'm saying it's courageous, because it would be much more convenient, I imagine, and I remember, to live to script rather than dropping into what's really here beneath script and in deep relationship with yourself and with the other person.
Yeah, I think it's the moment you know the quality of real deep presence with one another, you don't really want to go back to the surface. Stay at the surface level.
Yeah, so that makes me ask a really unplanned question, which is, I wonder in your life before, which I'm going to ask you to describe for the audience, did you feel lonely? Did you know loneliness compared to what you experience now? Or was it just a completely different energetic state that you lived in when you were a big bad corporate?
I'm noticing how deeply your question touches me. The question of loneliness, I think. It's almost like maybe there were two Miriams. And I started out as an engineer, and I think there was a deep yearning in me to understand the world. And at the same time, I noticed even already when I was a kid that I was relatively perceptive. And there was no way of scientifically explaining what I was perceiving. I think I was pretty good at times picking up how people were feeling. And I felt really weird, something that I wanted to hide. And so I I cultivated some form of armor when I went into that corporate world, and I was pretty smart, and I was navigating highly political environments, and I think I had an armor of anger and intensity. And when I came to Integral Coaching Canada, it felt like my weirdness was no longer weird. It was a talent that I could use to be a coach. And so it was really some peeling away of the layers of armor in order to feel the rawness and let my perceptions inform me. So yes, it was lonely because I felt like I was crazy for so many years. It just wasn't part of normal conversations where I was living.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I'm crazy and I'm coping. I'm crazy and I'm conforming. We live in this duality. So many people, I think, if they were to compare the script that they have internally versus the words that they use externally, the person they feel themselves to be somewhere and the version of themselves that lives outside, the polarity is quite stark, depending on where you're at in your life, in your development. You mentioned at the beginning that safety, when you come into that energetic field with another person, perhaps safety is one of the critical foundations needed in order to sink into deep curiosity in relationship. And as a culture, we are so used to that concept in romance, but somehow we've put romance relationships and maybe perhaps parent-child relationships in one category, deserving of deep attention, requiring of deep stability and safety. But our day-by-day relationship dynamics with other people, we don't give the same level of honouring or slowness to. And I guess as I picture you coming into ICC, because at the time, am I right, you had not intended to become a coach. I mean,
Nope.
That wasn't, where we find you right now, that wasn't your life plan.
No. I walked into that classroom and I was on a 1-year sabbatical, and I thought I'd add some coaching skills to my executive leadership tool belt. So no, the intention had not been to become a coach, just a more deeply informed leader.
Which you are, but now in a very different sphere. Was that experience, that shift in trajectory, do you relate that to the fact that you were able to suddenly feel, as you entered into this sphere of people talking about the deep things, wanting to go below the surface, do you attribute your shift in domain to being welcomed by a collective that felt resonant to you, that feeling of belonging and, oh, finally, I'm similar to, there's a home here?
Yes, certainly that. And I was, thinking back across my career, I was lucky enough to be on leadership programs, and I usually found myself hanging out in the evening at the table with the coaches and trainers. So even without knowing or being able to articulate that, I think I was deeply curious about how I would have articulated it back then, these engineers of human development.
It's like the little kid that only makes friends with the adults. That was absolutely my experience as a kid. I found children of my own age bizarre and uncontrollable and unruly. And I found grown-ups delightful because they were willing to be interested in the things that, for me, felt like they made the world go round. And kids, not so much. And as I look back, I can see how much I missed by not allowing myself to be a child. But I often wonder whether those of us that are of that kind, we do end up gravitating towards jobs and opportunities that allow us to steward and support and guide in a way that we knew we had from our earliest days.
I think so, and also I think we can be kids now. But I remember when we were talking, there was always a fun twist and a candor that if we were just wearing our adult masks, we wouldn't be capable of.
Yeah, so it's this thing about posturing. If you were to describe to the people that are with us what you used to believe about the world, that global perspective, what the world is, how I have to be within it in order to survive it well, what might happen if I don't. Could you describe that picture to us of what you used to believe versus probably what you believe now?
The world never felt as an unsafe place to me, and I noticed how much happiness I think I was able to feel even as a kid. I think I was just a happy child. So I experienced the world as being inherently safe. And that is still true. But there was definitely a part of me when I was in my, I'd say, scientific and corporate career that felt the world is safe when I am in control, when I am strong. And what it means to be strong is very different to what strong means for me now.
Can you tell us the difference?
It's almost best described in how my body feels different. Back then, the body was controlled. Usually my muscles would be contracted, the posture rigid. I was also a woman 20 years younger than all my male colleagues. So I needed to be very robust and stand my ground, literally. When today the world is safe because there's a constant flow and I can flow with it. I don't need to control because controlling it isn't even possible.
It's the difference between living in the world, I think, living in the lived experience. I don't want that to sound too esoteric for everyone that's listening, but there's this question of, am I really in the true dynamic that's here? Am I awake and open and available to the opportunities that are all around me, to the flow, to the dance, however you want to describe it, versus I'm playing a limited game that I've designed and I am the orchestrator of, and I have to hold on to very tightly, and I have to control other people within in order for the right outcomes to arrive. And those outcomes are right based on how much they please me or how much they displease me or how much they reconfirm my position or not. It always feels so tight and rigid, and in some ways quite painful. If I think back to the version of me that was maybe similar to the version of you, control was such a huge thing for me to let go of. And I will admit that in my first year of trying to, which was about a decade ago, I was in flagrant rebellion all of the time. I did it because I was a good girl and I was terrified of being rejected if I was disobedient. That was my early patterning coming through. But if you had asked me what my emotional experience was like of leasing my control, taking my hands out of every intimate decision, taking my hands out of manipulating other people to get the impact that I thought that I wanted or that I thought was good for everyone else, I found that excruciating. I found surrender into trust of the collective and of the wider wisdom that I could perceive if I really dropped back and moved through my body and moved through my wider perspective. That was terrifying for me. Did you have any of that fear?
Yes, just that when you were talking about the game, for me what came up is a board, like when you play a game on a board. And in a way you're limited in your moves to what is available on the board.
Of course.
And you want to make sure everyone's playing according to the rules on the board. And that step of leaving the board.
Yeah, you can't see around you. Your eyes are hyper-focused to the square in front of you and the players, but you can't see any of the periphery around.
And I probably went through waves of being completely terrified that there is no board anymore, no prescribed rules for my moves, and also the exhilarating freedom of just choosing my move in the very moment and not caring so much what others think, but doing moves that feel genuinely right in that moment. Doesn't mean that I'm breaking any rules. I'm just moving from what's alive rather than an assumption that I'm making based on what I know.
How many people, Miriam, would you say you think walk around as though there is some watchful figure behind them checking whether they're being good or doing right, or I almost think that we live as though a parent or a teacher is still there marking our progress in what we're willing to step towards and what we're not.
I would say almost everyone, and I would include myself, because there are moments where that voice, am I doing the right thing, still appears. And maybe that's also, maybe we need that from time to time to question what we're doing. But the voice has a very different quality. It's no more the punishing voice, but it's more of a voice like, are you sure? Isn't there more?
So it's a much more loving question and a much more loving delivery. I guess that statement of am I doing the right thing probably no longer disguises, will I still be loved? Am I good enough? Am I worthy?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you remember when you shared that fear?
Yes. Yeah. And I also think it's not one day it's there and then the next day it's gone, but it's more and more situations in which you feel capable of not feeling the fear or not being controlled by it.
I wonder what it's like for you from the place that you're at now. You've seen probably hundreds, if not thousands, of students go through your trainings. You've worked with so many clients and accrued so many hours of expertise. I always wonder what it's like for an exquisite coach, therapist, analyst to move about in the world, in the rest of the world. There are certain people, I think, that feel very called and moved to look at things at the level of depth that we're describing. And in a very non-hierarchical sense, that is a distinction from many other people that are not interested in those domains. It makes me feel as though we are sometimes the witnesses or the watchers of the wider world. I suppose I wonder what that experience is like for you, if you resonate with that at all, if it's a strange thing to see so much.
There's a lot of pain that I see from people playing, being their own, like caught up in their own board game. That's why I love being a coach, to support them in questioning if the board they're on is the one they want to be on. And certainly something I'm working with is having a boundary around how much pain I can feel at any moment. And I've quite a few neurodiverse diagnoses, and I think I'm quite perceptive, and sometimes it can feel like I sit in a cafe and I see subtitles for what's going on for people, and that can be quite overwhelming. So my journey certainly in that is to know when I felt enough for now, to stay in but also protect my own system.
So you limit your exposure when you notice that the noise is getting to a level where it could be damaging for you?
Yes. I'm certainly more aware when I need time on my own, which I would never do when I was back then wearing my armour.
Because presumably when you're wearing your armour, part of the way that you win the game is by leading with strength and an ability to navigate everything and hold it all, and all of those narratives that we can say and they sound silly, but actually most people live relative to them or live through them. There was this, I've been writing, I'm writing a book, and I am at the moment in a process of deep exploration and explicitness in the experience that I had as an anorexic. And one of the passages that I was touching on yesterday was around the guttural feeling of power that it gave me to be in control and to live through this identity that always did more with less and never asked for help and needed of nothing, and conquering my own hunger, my own base bodily needs, my own desires, was absolutely a part of that same game. And in some ways, that was the most intimate, consistent place that I could practice it, because the variables were pretty minimal. It's just me versus the different parts of me. And none of that was conscious at the time at all. I mean, I would have A, denied that I had a disorder, and B, I would not have been aware of any of that level of drive. But the push, you described your body earlier, and that push that I could feel inside of myself that felt so muscular and satisfying. It's almost like punching someone else in the face. It gave me that feeling. And I think that's why people struggle to get off the chessboard, actually, because as long as the game's working for you, brilliant. And inevitably, I've seen this a lot with older men in my life, that when they get to a certain age and they leave their corporate position, it's at that moment that everything becomes really fragile, because suddenly they don't have the places where they can play that role anymore, and they're aware of mortality and they're aware of the fragility of the body. So all of the muscularity dissolves in some ways, which I guess makes me think about what you're describing, which is a place of self-preservation, self-selection, self-care that speaks to you. This is my fullness. This is enough. I have now received enough input, enough noise. I've cared for people sufficiently, and I'm going to sense for the moment when I take some time.
Yeah, and you know, this is also, I think, a moment of real courage, because you question something that has always been true in the past. You know, in individual coaching, we work with ways of seeing, which are conditional beliefs, and there was certainly something around, as long as I'm strong, stronger than others, maybe, then I'll survive in this environment. And now making that move, can you feel that move of I need to be by myself? That moment feels like everything's threatened that you've always believed was true. And so that is a true moment of courage, when you start questioning your beliefs. And there you need to move through and get to the other side, where only being strong and being able to push through is not the only way to be safe. But that is a really scary moment.
Yeah, I think for most people it's terrifying. You've described that so beautifully. Being strong in the world is my form of protection, let's say, even if I'm not consciously thinking that. And then going and spending time with myself is tender. It's intimate, it's maybe young, it's soft. And how can I know that that will be okay? How can I know that everything won't fall apart around me if I step back for a moment to look after myself? Most people that I work with at the beginning, certainly, they have had no real experience of self-tending with tenderness. They might not even have had it from other people in their lived memory. You said before that you believed that the world was safe, and I feel that in you. I also know that you've cultivated that in the work that you do, but a lot of the people that I meet, you can feel in the degree to which they hover up and away from their seat, from the speed that they talk at, from the reactivity that they live through. They don't feel safe at all. They've never learned that there is a world that exists that they can feel safe in.
Absolutely.
Talk to me, my love, about healing. We could take that as broadly as we want to. What is your experience of healing and what it takes?
I'm really careful with the word healing, because as coaches we're not therapists, and at the same time that there is a whole lot of healing that occurs in the deep work that we're doing, because as we just said, we've some learned patterns of being safe in the world, where we feel quite incomplete. And for me, the healing there is in coming to a form of being authentically me, and shedding the layers of the armor. I had one moment, I think, when I was in a meditation, and all of a sudden I could see myself as a baby lying in the snow, wolves coming at me, and like that was a visceral experience of a primal fear. And that image stayed with me, and I could feel how this primal fear had literally driven every one of my decisions since I remember taking decisions. And being able to ask myself, am I just experiencing that fear, or am I trying to avoid something with that decision as a reaction to that fear or not? I think that was a deep, deep healing. So I think every layer, every belief that we can let go to be truly and authentically safe is a form of healing.
You're making me think about even the capacity to fall in love. That in one sense, if that decision is a good one, if it's well made and well matched, that there's a profound form of healing that comes in through deep romantic relationship.
Yes, and I think even every encounter can be like that. And maybe I'm sometimes cynical about why we are in romantic relationships. And I'm married for almost 25 years to a wonderful husband. And sometimes I wonder if what we seek in our romantic relationships is really a compensation for things that we lack from our childhood, or sometimes I wonder if it's more a band-aid than a healing. So the way I live relationships is that every single conversation is one of being deeply seen and deeply seeing. And in every conversation, even a silent one, there can be a deep healing of a tiny little part of me. Just that smile of the other person, of feeling them in their essential humanness and them feeling me. That's miraculous.
I was thinking before we joined the air today that you're someone who doesn't boundary their love, from what I can see. My memory of you during our training was of an incredibly loving presence, that boundaried in the way that any professional would be, but also arguably more loving than I had experienced in quite a lot of therapists or coaches. And that was consistent with Jenny Tipper, who's also been on the podcast, with Taylor Davison, who's also been on the podcast, who are both ICC figures. So I guess I wonder about that, your willingness to be of love, to give love in all of your dynamics.
So and that's quite an evolution also in that for me. I think it just started out with me being mesmerized by another human being who would be willing to spend time with me as a coach, as a mentor, as a teacher, and a true deep fascination with that other human being. And through my spiritual practice, I think that there was a moment when I felt that unconditional love is not coming from me, but through me. And so I'm sitting in a field of unconditional love, which is still, I think, tinted by Miriamness, but it's not coming from this limited me. It's just something vaster.
Do you think, love, that we are afraid of? Does it feel risky to show love out there in the world? I'm curious what your perspective is on why that's not a universal experience that we're leading society with.
I had a super interesting conversation recently with someone who wasn't in our, as closely in our, I'd say, coaching bubble. And love is a bit misleading, I think, because if we're not in the bubble, I would say love feels more connected to romantic love. And I think what we mean is some deep empathy, compassion, and my earlier self would have said love is risky because what you love you can lose, and then you experience pain. And I think I can love or give love to everyone in so many ways, which doesn't prevent me from being discerning or from telling someone, look, what you did just wasn't okay. And I think sometimes it's misleading to say I'm loving as if I was forgiving everything, or I would not be discerning. And by being fully present, I think you can be both deeply loving and fully discerning.
Yeah, it becomes really binary, doesn't it? And in some ways, that word, that label, then comes to define how you're meant to be in the world. I see that a lot. If I was to think about my earliest beliefs around love, I would have associated love with openness and warmth of behavior, which is different from the all-encompassing feeling that you were describing. And for me, that was risky because it was embarrassing and it would be not received. And it made me a target. And also in some ways, it diminished my respectability and intelligence. It was too much of what the other person didn't want. And so I remember going from that place as a kid where I was, playful and quite bouncy and I guess in some ways a bit ungainly, a bit inelegant, and then cultivated this real, refined, withheld version of myself. And people would have said that I was captivating. I got that quite a lot as a statement. And my intelligence never got questioned again. And my sort of wantability was assured. But you could never really have me either, because the real me that was living underneath that outside skin would have been convinced that the whole show would fall to its knees if I was to again show the openness of my heart. And I think that's why I thought it was risky.
Well, it sounds like there was a strategy that really worked.
It really did for about 3 decades.
Yeah. So we learn something and we assume that it's true because it worked.
Yeah, I think I was more attached to how I thought things looked on the outside than how they felt on the inside. In fact, that's definitely true because I didn't. They talk about dissociation in a body sense, and you and I probably both know that as an experience physiologically. I regularly just exited my body, especially when I was in pain. But I think actually fundamentally for most of those years I was exiting myself on a much wider level of dissociation. And so I stayed attached, grasping to the outside stuff. And inside, if you had put a gauge on my day-to-day experience, it would have been really isolated, really sad, and quite hard, actually. And I know now that we don't have to live in that way, but like you were so beautifully describing before, it's layers and layers of curiosity and outdated belief and being in a space where you're given the active encouragement with another person that what's true for you or the prospect of your life is important enough to them to give it a go at playing.
Exactly. Yeah. And usually, when you and I, we know when people come to coaching, they start having a suspicion that some of their strategies don't work anymore. But it feels way too risky to just go, oh, I'll do something else. My corporate self, I had trained myself to only sleep for 4 hours a night for a month. Because as long as I work hard, then I'm successful. And I could not rest. rest felt almost like death. And my biggest thing was I needed to find some balance. I had 3 kids and I was still working more than 50 hours a week. And with that belief in place, I could not stop. I could not rest. Because resting was weak. And as a warrior, you can't just go to sleep on a battlefield. And so this is when people come to coaching, it doesn't work. And everything that I know could work feels so scary.
You talk a lot in the ICC literature, and I remember this from our time together, about spotting and naming resistance in the client or even in the coach. It sounds like that's what you're talking about, is this way that we rebel from the change that we can feel is being indicated because there's so much protective benefit in the way that we were.
Yeah. And in a way that strategy has ensured our survival up to the point where we are now. That's the only thing we may know that ensures our survival, socially, emotionally, or literally. And you can't just say, okay, go stop doing that, do something else. So what we do a lot is honor and recognize what this strategy has allowed for. So that's part of why I'm so fascinated with human beings. It's what has brought you to the point of believing this is true. And one of my basic assumptions is that no one's crazy. So there is a good reason to hold that belief. And so how can we work with that without saying it's wrong? Because it was very right at some point, but it's limiting now. How can we expand it? And in integral coaching, we talk about including and transcending. We're not telling you to never, ever again work hard. So what we work on is making a choice. Is it the right moment to work hard, or maybe is it the moment to rest?
I remember learning quite early on in your modality that action that was symbolic, that helped you to cultivate a missing skill or a missing belief, that was a very important part of the coaching experience. And certainly, if I think about the coaching industry relative to the therapeutic industry, action has often been the thing that's been profoundly emphasized. I think not always with the honoring that you're describing. There seems to be, as I scan my world, there seems to be a tendency actually to really propel people into action, but they haven't necessarily learnt the skills or gained even the nervous system window of tolerance that would allow them to sustain the action. And I see that with people, they expand, professionally even, they expand to 5-6 figure incomes and then they collapse 2 years later because they just haven't been able to get used to or resource themselves in the way that they need to keep that going. Would you tell the audience about how you see action, why action feels important for you when we're in the process of change?
Insight alone isn't enough. If very often our clients, they know exactly what's going on and what they should be doing. So what we do with our actions, we call them practices in integral coaching, is that we challenge this belief system, and in a relatively safe moment where we're developing with the client a practice and saying, well, how about you do this? You certainly can think about a client who's very assertive in a meeting and their topic may be around listening more or being, having better communication skills. So that tiny practice may be that the next once a day in a meeting, they will take a breath before answering and ask another question. So we're poking that belief system that may say, as long as I can reply immediately with a competent answer. And we're just saying, try it a little differently and notice what's happening. And we would not do that in the most high-risk environment, because this is, again, where the belief system would go, no, this is really dangerous. So in a relatively safe situation, go try something different, see what happens. And so we're falsifying or just challenging that initial belief system so that they can not just think that something different would happen, but they can see a different outcome.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people, they want their motivation to rise before they're willing to take the action. They want to take the action. That seems to stall them at the gates. And they want to take the action in the direction of that key action. But I almost feel like what you're describing is, don't look over here, look over there, in this area that's more low risk, and let's practice.
You don't start practicing at the Olympic Games.
Yeah. It makes complete sense. It's just so often not where our wiring is. Our wiring has set us up as good or bad, depending on whether we do the action. And so we just continue to live in this quite binary, overly focused agenda that this is the goal that I need to just push myself hard enough to get to. Because I remember with Jenny, who was my teacher for the first training, when she interviewed me, her ask of me, she deemed, I don't know where she got this idea from, but she deemed that I might be someone that was quite attached to regimen and routine and found rest difficult and was in some ways dominating the lived experience. And so she said, okay, before you decide to sign up to the course, I'd like you to practice 1 day a week not making your bed. And I was horrified that someone that was this highly qualified was asking me not to make my bed. All of my intellectual snobbery absolutely hit the roof of my head. But I also absolutely didn't do it. I completely flagrantly ignored her. I was so convinced that my own way was right, as you do in that mentality, that I signed up for the course and completely ignored her guidance. And then bless her, she asked me about it when we started the course, and I had to admit that I had made no inroads to being messy or unruly. And her response really struck me. She didn't make me bad for it. She didn't tell me I should have done. She didn't even let it slide. She got really curious with me. And she asked me, I wonder what was coming up for you in the moments that you thought about doing it, or even in the moment that I suggested it. I wonder which part of you felt threatened. And that led to much more beneficial data for me, a much more intimate way of meeting myself than if I had chastised myself, which was subtly what I was doing. I had 2 layers. One was the arrogant layer that said, I'm right, she's wrong. And underneath was the bad child feeling of, no, but I've not done what my teacher says, and I will now be punished. And I just thought that was so artful, and it matches so much what you're describing, this non-judgmental lens.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to the fact that we honor a strategy that's worked. Otherwise, you wouldn't have pursued that strategy for so long.
So that means that you must be showing people unconditional love when they're in your coaching space.
Is it unconditional love? I think that what I started out with was likely judgment being replaced by curiosity. You know, coming from where I came from, curiosity was more accessible, and that led me into a place where I wasn't judgmental. And that could bring me into a place of genuine love.
You mentioned the word forgiveness before. And I suppose on a more personal tangent, I wonder what your experience has been like with processes of forgiveness in your own life or of yourself.
That feels really tender. And what immediately comes up for me is my kids and the way I parent. So when I started training at Indigo Coaching Canada, my youngest was 1.5 years old. And when you uncover all these things that you did from a place of reactivity, the things that you say because you're worried, I found that very hard to forgive myself. And I think where I'm now is I could have never started this journey. And something that was really, really interesting, I think, which describes how I'm feeling towards myself, is that one of my daughters, she was quite an angry teenager. And at some point she said, "Mom, I know I was horrible. What should I say sorry for?" And I said, "Nothing, darling, because I know you were in pain. And you just need to hear from time to time that it was hard and I'm tired." And I think this is how I relate to myself. Yes, I was in pain, or I was worried about. When you tell your kid, study harder, it's because you're worried about their future. Being able to connect to my fear for this future now lets me use different words.
Gosh, that's so beautiful. We have reciprocally reduced each other to tears. Two very professional coaches over here just sobbing on YouTube. Oof. Thank you so much for sharing that. I was listening to a podcast yesterday which was sharing the story of a Buddhist monk who went into an extended silent retreat for 4 years, and he said that it was 2 years of him in battling suffering in relative isolation, which culminated in him trying to flee the monastery, climbing over the wall, running away, and then actually pausing and thinking, what in God's name am I doing? I have to go back, and then having to beg his way back into the doors to go back in for another 2 years. But he said that so much of that early experience was the suffering of all of his old stories and all of the things that he hadn't forgiven himself for. And that he got to a place where he realized that the flex, the trick, wasn't to keep thinking the thoughts, to keep thinking and working your way through the narratives in an almost therapeutic fashion. It was to feel the experience of that memory or that grief and let it How old are your children now?
My son is almost 13. I have a 15-year-old and a 19-year-old. No, she'll be 16 in 2 weeks. She'll never forgive me if I make her 15.
It makes me wonder if I can ask you one other question that might be personal, but it's from the perspective of the listener. I work with a lot of women, and we get a lot of questions from women that are navigating the juggle of family life, motherhood, wifedom, and business. And because this podcast started as a space for a lot of space holders, a good chunk of our audience are either self-developers or therapists, coaches, body workers, wonderful people that do so much. And they do in all of these areas. And I get asked a lot about finding balance. And I also get asked a lot about letting go with love, particularly around your children and particularly when they're suffering. And I suppose I wonder if there's anything you would offer from your lens on that practice, process, growth edge.
One thing that is really banal, I think, and which I have to remind myself of over and over again, is nothing's gonna last. You have these moments when it's really hard, and then you feel like it's never gonna end. The first time I had this realization was with my second daughter, and I'm starting to spoon feed her. And and then it's one day, and she's just spitting it out. It doesn't work. And another day. And then I look back, like, is she ever gonna get it? Kind of impatience. And then I thought back to my oldest daughter, and I realized it was 2 weeks. And you know, as they move through life, sometimes there's really hard places, and we've had long stretches of things being really hard. And yes, nothing's gonna last forever. And what I'm just reminding myself is to also acknowledge, yes, it's hard for you and it's hard for me. And I do love you. Like that's probably what I start with, is I love you. And I know it's hard for you in the moment. Like kids acting out in quotes, it is a reaction to some form of pain or being desperate. And this is where, having done all the learning and development, looking at my children, seeing the world from their perspective is really helpful. And sometimes just sit down and cry with them.
Yeah, you don't have to change it. It's part of that.
And I would love to control the world to make things easy for my kids.
Of course.
And I can't.
I think that is one of the most important pieces of guidance, and in some ways can be the hardest for people to really take on board. I have been surrounded by a lot of people that have addiction in the family, in their kids, and you see, and sometimes you're lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with the parent or the sibling to really help them through that process, because being on the sideline when somebody else suffers, especially if you feel like you have a duty of care to look after them or to prevent what's going to happen or to spot to them what they can't spot from where they're sitting, the urge of that is overpowering. And I see the wreckage it leaves on mothers and fathers and loved ones. But it becomes, from what I've seen and also experienced, it becomes that lesson about having to let go and having to love and let go and still be there. It's like you're staying, but you're also leaving on some level in terms of your level of control. That practice then becomes a life practice. You learn it there in the most difficult place, and it revolutionizes how you see the world. Maybe it puts you into this place of more interactivity and less dominance, or more interactivity and less anxious passivity. You feel what your level of agency is and what it isn't.
And still practicing with my kids is the hardest.
Yeah.
I can feel so utterly incompetent with my kids. And yeah, I think that's the ultimate practice of letting go. Not being dominated by your fears and worries about everything they're going to experience in their lives.
Well, you started the recording by referencing this idea of welcoming whatever is present. And I guess you can't exclude this bit.
Oh.
No. My love, you shared so much and of such depth and beauty, as I was expecting. I wonder if there's anything in your heart that you would like to leave the audience with. Anything we haven't touched on that feels really important, or anything we have that you'd like to reinforce?
I want to thank you for this invitation, because what you did is look beyond the layers. And you were talking about healing, being seen in such a way is healing. And at even I think a level of essentially humanity between people.
Well, I think you're rather magic, and I think we're the same. Humans are they're my fascination point. They were for such a long time my foe, the thing to be terrified of. And then at some point they changed into the most amazing puzzle, almost with your engineer brain. But I think more my experience is that I see the shine of them. I see the light inside of them. And with someone like you, because you so touched my experience, that's a reciprocal moment. You can't be touched by someone and not see their insides at the same time. I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah. And just what came up for me is when you stop othering the other.
Yeah. Yeah. In a relational sense, for me, that's when it feels like love is here. Because you're in the belly of the space, which includes both of you and wraps around you. Oh, you beautiful creature. So we're going to leave Miriam to her snowy Alp-based scenery and her skiing children, and just share so much gratitude to you for coming and being with us. I'm going to make sure, everyone, that we have all of the details for how you get in touch with Miriam, with ICC, to find out more about the work that she and they do. And if you've been with us and you've enjoyed this episode, please just, if you're willing, take a little moment and think about whether there's anyone you can share it with, anyone that needs a little nugget of this beautiful woman's wisdom. And if you're able to, just pop us a little review or a rating. It really helps to foster the community that we're building here, and it lets this broadcast reach so many more people internationally, which is my greatest hope and wish for this broadcast. We love you very much. We're so grateful for your time and your investment, and wherever you are, I wish you a really beautiful, self-embracing, curious time. Until next time.